Hello, everyone. My name is Darla Saunders, and on behalf of the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation and the Canadian Rivers Institute, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. This series is made possible in part thanks to the contributions of the Government of Canada. We're absolutely delighted to be launching our 6th season of the webinar series with renowned salmon biologist Gerald Chaput of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. For nearly 4 decades, Gerald has wet his boots and dipped his hands in diverse aquatic ecosystems throughout central, eastern, and Arctic Canada, and as far east as the Pechora River in Russia. Since 1987, he has worked as a fisheries biologist with DFO at the Gulf Fisheries Center in Moncton, New Brunswick, an office strategically located within less than 3 hours' drive of 3 world-renowned diadromous species rivers. In his current position with DFO, he coordinates the regional science peer review process to address management requests for science advice on diverse issues ranging from fisheries, ecosystem management, and species at risk. His main interests include assessment methods, population dynamics and modeling, and the development of management frameworks, including reference points and the precautionary approach. He continues to work closely with the diadromous fish science team in Moncton and maintains close collaborations and interactions with international scientific colleagues throughout the ICES Working Group on Salmon and NASCO. After the presentation, we'll be opening the floor for a question and answer session. You'll have the option of asking your questions directly using your microphone or telephone line, or you can type them in and we'll read them aloud. I will now turn the webinar over to Gerald.
Thank you very much, Darla. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a bit unusual, I guess, for me to be speaking at a distance and not seeing the audience, but perhaps it should be easier in that context. So it gives me pleasure to be here this afternoon with you and to impart, I guess, share with you some information which I've accumulated, I guess, over a number of years and with colleagues. So the title of this talk is Atlantic Salmon, Changing Survival Patterns and Shifting Populations. And what I want to cover are basically 5 main themes. The first part is we'll look back a bit at the animal itself, this iconic species, what it is, where it came from, talk about some of the variations which we see in life history and why those variations are important. Talk a bit about sequential trade-offs in fitness. Basically, we're talking about survival issues, freshwater survival, marine survival. Looking at what's happened over time with Atlantic salmon in terms of survival and abundance. I think that's a key question that people have. Why are there not more salmon? And then address some of the issues with why we don't know as much as we would like to about Atlantic salmon. How come we don't know everything we need to know? And then finally finish off with just a reminder to ourselves that survival for salmon, it's not a random process. It's not a roll of the dice. It's actually quite complex, but there may be things we can do to help Atlantic salmon win in the future. Of course, before I proceed, I just want to remind everyone that I'm basically here presenting information that has been accumulated by a large number of people. I want to acknowledge the colleagues, I guess, internationally from various countries in the North Atlantic that actually have brought a lot of this information, which I'm going to summarize for you this afternoon. But even those people at ICES and myself, we rely upon the work and contributions of countless individuals that monitor populations, compile data, do studies, either from governments, from NGOs and Aboriginal communities, and also a very large and diverse scientific community, people who work on Atlantic salmon, but also who study species generally, and that improves our understanding about ecology and all these animals. So on that point, then, I just want to acknowledge that I'm really speaking here on behalf of a very large community, and I hope I can give some credit to the knowledge they've imparted to all of us on Atlantic salmon. So just a bit of background, just a reminder about some of the things that we'll be talking about. So we're talking about Atlantic salmon. I just want to always stress to people that Atlantic salmon is a freshwater fish. It needs freshwater to spawn, and it goes to sea really as a life history option. It doesn't have to go to sea. A lot of populations of Atlantic salmon are landlocked. They're waterfish populations, and so I think we have to always remember that in the context of we look at population dynamics. The other thing, we call it a salmon, but it really is a trout. In contrast to Pacific salmon, which are the big species, the ones that get a lot of attention. Well, Atlantic salmon doesn't die necessarily spawning, it can repeat spawn, whereas Pacific salmon do die. So a bit of a difference there, but I'll come back to it. You know, Atlantic salmon really is a trout. Other definitions that I'll be some terms I'll be using in the talk. Smolt. I think I think we all know what that is, but just to remind ourselves that a smolt is a juvenile life stage that moves from freshwater to the ocean. And when I talk about the adult salmon coming back, the other spawners, I'll actually be referring to sizes of salmon, small salmon and large salmon. There's a lot of jargon with salmon, a lot of terminology. When I speak about small salmon, I'll also sometimes be using the word 1C winter salmon interchangeably. They're basically fish that are less than 63 centimeters fork length. And conveniently, most of those animals are adult fish coming back that have spent 1 year at sea. The other size group I'll talk about is large salmon, and sometimes I'll refer to them as multi-sea winter salmon. And it's a collective of a lot of different age groups, and they're basically defined by size. And these large salmon are fish greater than 63 centimeters, but they include, you know, maiden fish, 2C winter, 3C winter, they include repeat spawners and so on. It's just a convenient way of looking at these age groups coming back in, and I'll refer to those quite a bit, but keep in mind that when I talk about these two size groups, that's what they actually mean. So Atlantic salmon, what is it? Well, it's a Salmonidae. It's the salmon family. It's in a subfamily called Salmonidae. And just to remind ourselves that the Pacific salmonine group and the Atlantic salmonines, they diverged about 20 million years ago. So, you know, the history with Pacific salmon, Atlantic salmon, you know, it's been quite a few years since they've actually had sort of common ancestry. And until about 5 million years ago, Atlantic salmon and its close counterpart, the brown trout, actually had a common ancestor. So Atlantic salmon really became its own species outright about 5 million years ago. So not that long in terms of evolutionary timescales. But more recently, about 600,000 or 700,000 years ago, Atlantic salmon, which was generally distributed in the Atlantic Ocean, actually diverged into two groups: a Northwest Atlantic salmon group, which is now located in eastern North America, and a Northeast Atlantic group that's located, well, in the Northeast Atlantic. And that separation has been fairly complete to the point that they now have different chromosome pairs, with Northwest Atlantic salmon having about 54 chromosome pairs, and Northeast Atlantic salmon having 58 chromosome pairs. So the degree of isolation has been sufficient that that divergence has occurred in those two groups that share a common environment in the North Atlantic. And more recently, on the Northeast Atlantic side, there's been another divergence occurred since the last glaciation, the retreat of the glaciers, and it's a development of a subgroup in the Baltic. In the Baltic Sea, there are Atlantic salmon, but they spend their entire life cycle in the Baltic Sea. They actually don't migrate to the Atlantic Ocean. They don't exchange with the Atlantic salmon on the Atlantic side, and they've developed their own subgroup to the point that the isolation has been sufficient that the Baltic salmon have a resistance to a parasite called Gyrodactylus. They can tolerate that, they can live with it. But when that parasite was introduced on the Atlantic side, the Northeast Atlantic salmon actually were very susceptible to it. They caused a lot of devastation in Atlantic salmon populations. So even over a period of 18,000 years or less, you see quite a bit of selection taking place and divergence taking place in these population groups. Now, over about 700,000 years of which the Northeast Atlantic salmon, Northwest Atlantic salmon have diverged, those two groups have actually gone through some quite large climatic and geophysical variations. So, for example, over the last 800,000 years or so, the period over which the divergence occurred between the Northeast and Northwest Atlantic salmon, the climate was punctuated by a large series of glacial and interglacial conditions, about 100,000 years in terms of cycles between those glacial periods. And you can see that the climate based on ice cores from Antarctica has indicated that the temperatures are being also quite variable. And the range of variation in terms of global temperatures is actually quite large. We're talking about 10 degrees Celsius variation in average global temperatures. That's quite a large range, but through that all those variations, Atlantic salmon has persisted, Atlantic salmon has diverged and colonized and probably lost a lot of areas, but it has persisted through these large variations in climate and large variations in geophysical conditions. Now, since the last glacial period, about 18,000, from 75,000 years to about 18,000 years ago, when the ice sheets expanded over large parts of North America and into Europe, a lot of habitat was lost to salmon. But at the same time, we might say that new habitat was created, even during the glacial period, because at the maximum extent of the glaciers, the sea levels are about 120 meters lower than they are now. So if you can imagine the sea level being 120 meters below where it is presently, you have the Grand Banks of Newfoundland would be exposed, would be terrestrial. And Georgia, the bank off George's Bank would be terrestrial. And a lot of the continental shelf off eastern Canada would be terrestrial. So although we've lost all the area where salmon currently exist, other habitat was available for salmon. In fact, that is where probably they had refugia. But since about 11,000 years ago, when the climate started to warm, the glaciers retreated, we now see Atlantic salmon actually colonized and expanded back into these areas that were liberated from the ice. And now we find Atlantic salmon in about 2,000 rivers in the North Atlantic on both the northwest side and northeast side. And over that period of time, about 11,000 years or so, not only have they expanded their distribution, but they've also evolved diverse life history characteristics. Now, what I mean by life history characteristics are things like age-less multiplication, growth rates, stage of maturity, size maturity. We can think about a lot of other things. And all of those variations in life history characteristics are in part driven by genetics, but in large part, really, their response to climatic and environment variations. So we call that phenotypic plasticity. And I'll explain to you why that's important to have that variation. So an example of that would be age-less multiplication. So we know the river age-less multiplication is pretty well related to growth potential, which is really climate, temperature. So the warmer it is, the faster they grow. And we can see on the left, on the map on the left side, if you look at eastern North America, smolt age increases with latitude. So in the southern areas of eastern Canada, they're very young in terms of smolt age, averaging, let's say, 2 years. As you go into Labrador, we're getting to 5, 6, or 7 years of age. And this pattern of increasing smolt age with climate, with growth potential, is consistent whether you're talking about the Northwest Atlantic or the Northeast Atlantic. And that was demonstrated by, on the graph on the right, that was by a paper by Metcalf and Thorpe, who looked across the distribution, the range of distribution of Atlantic salmon, and showed that the mean age of salmon smolts actually increased as the index growth potential, which is really a temperature index here, decrease. So the warmer it is, the faster they grow, the younger they go to sea. And that is basically a response then to environment. We also see quite a lot of variation geographically in the age of salmon coming back to spawn after they go to sea. So there's sea age. So we see in eastern Canada, in the map on the left, quite a bit of diversity in terms of what sea age fish return. So for example, Newfoundland, which is all colored in red, they're predominantly, those populations come back after only one sea winter at sea. Compare that with the mainland parts of eastern Canada, where basically we have combinations of both one sea winter and two sea winter fish. And in parts of Gaspé in Quebec, and in deep blue, you have one sea winter, two sea winter, and three sea winter fish. So quite a lot of variation geographically, and within eastern North America. But again, if we look across the North Atlantic on the map on the right, we see the same kind of divergence or diversity if you look across the European population. So again, we have some areas like Ireland, Northern Ireland, so Ireland would be here, Northern Ireland, and Iceland, where basically large proportions of the adults returning to these areas are dominated by one sea winter fish. Whereas if you look at the northern populations of Russia, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, and if you look at England and Wales, and if you look again on North America, the US, and Quebec, and maybe the Southern Gulf, we have important proportions of multi-sea winter fish. So again, quite a bit of diversity within regions as to what the age of maturity when salmon come back from the ocean. So not only do they come back at different sea ages, one sea winter all the way up to 5 years at sea, but when they come back at those different ages, they have quite a large range in size. So body size can range from 45 to 70 centimeters for one sea winter fish, and it could be as high as large as over a meter if you're a 3 sea winter or a 5 sea winter maiden spawner. So quite a large variation, and because they can repeat spawn, they can come back and spawn many times, and that is quite common now from the population. They also grow with each spawning event. So we can see, for example, that a 1 sea winter maiden fish in this gray box here would have, let's say, 55 centimeters as an average size, But as the repeat spawning events occur, they increase in size, and the longer they spend going back to sea and reconditioning, the greater their body size increases. So again, it's a response to how much time they spend at sea indicates how big they're going to be. And the choice of repeat spawning strategy, whether you're a consecutive, a short reconditioning spawner, or an alternate repeat spawner, you spend more time at sea, imparts quite different responses in terms of size. But also, whether you become a consecutive or an alternate seems to be something that's flexible as well. We see all kinds of combinations of fish coming back as repeat spawners, as either consecutives or alternates, and all combinations you can think of. And then finally, if you look at sex ratio, well, it also varies by stage of maturity. And again, it depends upon the population, the type of population that you have. So for many of the one-sea winter fish returning as adults, for the most part, again, depending upon the population, they're probably dominated by males. Males come back predominantly as one-sea winter fish, except for populations like in Newfoundland, where all the fish come back as one-sea winter. Then you have a high proportion in those populations that are females. Again, the variation in males to females that you see at a maiden sea age depends very much upon the geographic location of those populations. Whereas the large salmon, the multi-sea winter fish, are generally dominated by females. Females come back larger, and there's a reason for that, because as body size increases, the number of eggs that are produced increases. So there's a benefit to being larger because you produce more eggs. But also, as body size increases, egg diameter increases. The larger females have more eggs, and the eggs are also larger, which can impart some benefit to survival and spawning success. So basically, if we look at salmon as a species, you would say that they spawn, a moderate number of eggs. It's not a small number. It's a couple thousand. It's not a large number. It's not in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So they spawn a moderate number of eggs. But the thing is that the eggs are quite large. They're, let's say, 5 to 7 millimeters diameter, which is large for fish. We can think of a lot of other species of very tiny eggs, and these larger eggs actually have a benefit to survival at hatching and at emergence. So why is this important? Well, all these life history characteristics, in part are important in terms of resilience and persistence of populations. So the more diverse the life history, the more options the animal has to come back, the population has, the more it can resist catastrophic events or unexpected events. So in many cases, in recent literature, we're talking about the portfolio effect. So you basically spread your investments widely. So if something goes wrong in one end, you hopefully you'll be able to benefit from the other. So just an example of what I mean by that diversity, if we look at a population that has 3 smolt ages and 2 sea ages, and forgetting about repeat spawners, then we can look at how the eggs that are spawned 1 year, how they work through over time. And in the context of, if you look at just what happens in freshwater, from the egg deposition in 1 year, you will have, within the river, up to 5 age groups present, and up to 5 year classes present in the river. So anytime we go to the river and we sample juvenile salmon in the river, we'll be looking at juveniles that originated from 5 different year classes. If we look at when they go to sea and what's in the ocean, when those fish go out at different smolt ages and when they spend different times at sea, we'll have in the ocean at any given time up to 6 age groups, maiden age groups, so combination of river age and sea age. And at sea, there will be 5 year classes are out there feeding and growing and potentially returning. So it's not 1 year class at sea, it's up to 5 year classes. And when the fish come back to spawn, in any given spawning run, in this case for this example, there could be 6 age groups when we look at combinations of river age and sea age, but there'll be 4 year classes in an actual spawning run. So this is how the salmon as a species spreads its reproductive potential and its recruitment potential over many years, and within a given habitat there can be several year classes. Now if we consider repeat spawning life histories, because Atlantic salmon can do that, that actually adds extensively to the diversity. So for example, when you look at repeat spawning life histories that come in, a single year class of salmon can contribute up to 8 years in terms of spawning events. And in a river like the Miramichi, currently, where we have a lot of repeat spawners, in any spawning run, there can be up to 8 year classes. So the spawning run in a given year does not depend upon 1 year class. It actually is spread out over quite a large number of years. And repeat spawning is actually quite important. In the Miramichi, for example, currently we've sampled up to 52 different age spawning histories. That's not talking about river age, we're just talking about maiden sea age, consecutive spawning ages, and number of repeat spawnings. And then in the Miramichi, we've measured or estimated from scales salmon coming back on a 7 spawning migration, so quite extensive. And in Finland, the Reviteno, a very northern population, they have quite diverse repeat spawning histories as well. And it's looking at the combination of smolt ages, which can go from 2 to 8 years, maiden sea ages, which are 1 to 5 years, and previous spawners. They've identified 120 combinations of freshwater and CH spawning history. So very large diversity of ages and spawning histories in that river. And generally the northern populations that have a large range of smolt ages, a large range of multi-sea winter life histories, are probably more resilient than southern populations that have maybe limited smolt age diversity, let's say 2-year-old smolts perhaps, predominantly, and also single stage at maturity, so 1 sea winter only. So northern populations are more diverse, and any population that has a high diversity of life history characteristics potentially would be more resilient and would persist better under varying environmental conditions than southern populations that are actually quite limited. So I guess we could ask is why anadromedy? Why does salmon go to sea? Well, anadromedy basically is the choice of anadromedy is a trade-off between survival to reproduce and how much progeny you can produce. So it's a bit like a benefit to cost analysis. So why to go to sea? Well, production in the marine environment is considered to be density independent. So when you go to sea as a salmon, there aren't enough of you to compete with your conspecifics. So salmon won't compete in the ocean for resources. They'll compete with other things, but we think they don't compete with themselves because there's really not enough of them to do that. Secondly, when you go to sea, it's a big environment. There's lots of food, and if you eat enough, you can grow very fast. In fact, Atlantic salmon, when you look at its growth rates and size at different ages, it's one of the fastest growing fish that we know, and it's certainly faster growing than basically most of the Pacific salmon on the West Coast. And in fact, for a given year, in its first year at sea, it probably grows as fast as bluefin tuna in length, not in weight, but it's a fast growing fish. So growing fast means you can become larger very quickly, and being large is important because the larger you are, the greater your spawning success. You can produce more eggs, more sperm, and that has benefits to how many progeny you can produce. But a larger body size is also important for competition. You compete for mates, you compete for spawning areas. Larger females are bigger, they can dig up different substrate, they have access to more diverse substrates. So being bigger has its benefits. So what's the cost of going to the ocean? Well, death is one cost, and that's probably the main cost to going to sea, is that upwards of 90% of the animals that go to sea will probably die within 1 year. That's a very high mortality rate compared to other fish, and they have such a high mortality rate because salmon are risk takers. So they need to grow rapidly, they want to grow rapidly. To do that, you have to eat a lot, and when you eat a lot, you expose yourself to danger. And so if you must eat, then there's a high risk of being eaten, and invariably that's what happens at sea. But in terms of evolutionary trajectory, going to sea, the benefits have exceeded the cost of doing that. So that's why anadromedy occurs for Atlantic salmon. So what drives abundance for Atlantic salmon and diversity? Well, again, Atlantic salmon is a freshwater spawner. They need fresh water. They spawn in rivers. And this is where density-dependent regulation occurs. I mean, there's a constraint how many fish you can produce in a river. And the constraint basically is habitat. Habitat in the context of competing for shelter, competing for feeding territories, competing for food, and so on. So freshwater is where it initially starts, but freshwater is also where the bottleneck is. Now you can get fairly high survival rates in freshwater, although people may think that egg smolt survival rates, when we measure them, can be as high as 3%. That seems low, but for a fish, that's actually quite high, given that it probably occurs over 2 or 3 years. But you can see that you can get at low egg depositions in rivers, you can get survival rates that can exceed 3%, 5%. When we model these data sets from various rivers, if we use the Bevan-Holt relationship, we get about 5% survival at the origin. So at very low density, upwards of 5% of the eggs will produce smolts. As the egg depositions increase, as density increases, survival rate goes down. And at egg depositions of 500 eggs per 100 square meters on average, you will not get survival rates that exceed 1% in freshwater. So it's quite a strong bottleneck in freshwater, but at low densities, you can get quite high survival. So you have what I call basically high survival in freshwater can offset low survival rates at sea. And I think one trivial way to just understand that is to just use a simple example to say, what would survival rates have to be for a female spawner to replace herself? And this little diagram shows a quick example. So you have a 1 sea winter fish. It's a female, produces about 3,000 eggs per female. If the in-river survival rate's about 2%, so egg to smolt survival gives you 2%, she produces 60 smolts. How many of those smolts have to survive in order for that female to replace herself? Well, half and half, male to female. Survival rates at sea must be about 3.3% for that female to replace herself. So quite a low survival rate at sea really is sufficient for that female to produce her replacement offspring. If in-river survival rate drops by half, in this case, let's say the habitat is not as good, you only get 1% survival rate in the river, you need a doubling of sea survival to replace that female. So again, it's a direct trade-off. If survival rate in river increases, you can tolerate lower marine survival. On the other hand, if survival rate in river goes down, you have to have a concurrent improvement in marine survival for that population to replace itself. If you're a multi-sea winter female, you spent more time at sea, you're much bigger, you produce more eggs. At 1% survival in river, you produce 100 smolts, so quite a lot more smolts. And you can tolerate 2% cumulative survival at sea in order to replace that one female. Now that relationship between, I say cumulative survival because they spend 2 years at sea, so there has to be a first year survival and second year survival. And that dynamic between survival rate in the first year and survival rate in the second year, there's a number of possible survival rates, but if survival rate in the first year goes down, let's say 5% survival in the first year, you need a 40% survival in the second year for that female to replace itself. So there's some trade-offs there between what happens in the first year, what happens in the second year. But the point is, if you're a large female, produce a lot of progeny, you can tolerate a lower cumulative marine survival than if you're one sea winter female. But these are spawner replacement rates. These are quick calculations. So these replacement rates are not sufficient for a population to grow in abundance or to allow the population to persist through dramatic events where mortality increases. So you need higher combined freshwater marine survival rates for populations for long term to persist and to produce a lot of surplus production to spawners. So let's focus on the marine part, because that tends to be where a lot of the concern is right now. So what kind of return rates have we seen in terms of marine from the ocean for salmon? So I'm going to talk about return rates because rather than talking about survival, because I think sometimes there's a confusion. So if we look at how many adults come back from smolts that went to sea the previous year or previous years, if the population is exclusively a one sea winter population, so let's say all the adults come back as one sea winter fish, then that ratio of adults to smolts is a return rate, but it's also equivalent to sea survival. That's okay. But in populations where we have multi-sea winter stocks, where fish come back as one sea winter fish come back as 2 sea winter and 3 sea winters, when we do that calculation of return rate, which is adults to smolts, it's not sea survival, it's a return rate. And the reason is that there's a combination of survival in the first year, proportion maturing, and survival in the second year. So that return rate is what I present here in the figure, and that's the best we can do rather than talking about sea survival. But I think they're good proxies for what's happening in the ocean. And if we look at collectively, if we look across the distributional range of Atlantic salmon in the Atlantic, so we have from various countries estimates of return rates of adults to smolts, and whether they're from North America, from Iceland, or from Europe. And the red blocks are rivers in each of those areas where basically the population is a one sea winter population, so they come back as one sea winter fish. Or if they're in blue or teal, they're rivers that have multi-sea winter populations. You can see that basically for rivers that have one sea winter dominated returns, that the return rates are actually better than for rivers that are multi-sea winter populations. That's probably reasonable to think because they only spend 1 year at sea. Second thing we can see from this figure is that generally the return rates of smolts in the Northeast Atlantic, European side, and potentially in Iceland tend to be higher than the return rates in North America. Well, that's potentially because the environments are quite different, but that's the pattern that we see repeatedly, that salmon from North America tend to have lower return rates than salmon from Europe. The question is, I think of interest to us, is how have those return rates changed over time? Well, we can get some information from that when we look at rivers where smolts are monitored and adults coming back are monitored. When we actually measure return rates. And I think the general pattern is it's consistent, whether we're talking about North America or Northeast Atlantic, that over the past 4 decades or less, clearly return rates have declined. They've declined dramatically in some areas. If we look at the southern populations, these are hatchery populations, dramatic declines. We can see declines in Quebec over time. And if you look at the Northeast Atlantic, there's been some very severe declines, particularly, for example, these Irish stocks here, Northern Irish stocks and bush. The only condition where things don't seem to have declined are Icelandic stocks, where things seem to be quite variable, flat. And also we can point to perhaps the Western Arm Brook in Newfoundland. Keeping in mind, however, these are just returns to rivers, and it doesn't take account of any fish that were exploited in the marine environment in the past when there were commercial fisheries here, and when those were turned off, what happened. But basically, excluding this one here that we can probably attribute to something else, for the most part, the return rates have declined, and they've declined collectively in North America and in Europe. So has that resulted in reduced abundance? Well, we can do a bookkeeping exercise. It's called the run reconstruction. We can estimate the abundance of salmon at different points in the life cycle, and we'll focus on the marine phase. So we begin kind of working backwards, where we start to look at how many fish return to rivers. So we have examples where maybe we monitor the rivers, the returns to the St. John River, New Brunswick, the Nashwauk River, for example, and all the other rivers within the Bay of Fundy. We might do the same thing for the Southern Gulf areas and so on, all through Newfoundland and Labrador. So we have individual river returns. We kind of get an estimate from those, that how many come back to a region. And from we have all the regions covered, we can have an estimate of how many come back to Eastern Canada. These are just returns back to our rivers, what actually survived the marine environment. I say that because it's important to recognize that in the past we have some mixed stock fisheries that occurred very close to home waters. So Newfoundland and Labrador commercial fishery was a mixed stock fishery. It occurred very close. It occurred, let's say, a month or 2 months before salmon showed up in the rivers. And because of mixed stocks, we don't really know which populations they're from. So we can kind of reconstruct how many fish were there back to Eastern Canada collectively. And then we have to keep in mind that also, if we're interested in large salmon, there was the fishery at Greenland. The fishery at Greenland is also a mixed stock fishery. So if we want to know how many fish there were in the ocean before a lot of these things happened, a lot of these fisheries happened, we're kind of working at a large scale. So basically we're talking about the North Atlantic abundance. And then how many fish were there before we fished them? Then we can refer them to what we call pre-fishery abundance. In this case, we're interested in knowing how many fish were in the ocean as of January 1st of their first winter. So about 8 months after they went to sea, how many fish were actually in the ocean, and how has that changed over time? Well, we can do that for, in this case, for 2 size groups, for small salmon and large salmon. We can do it for fairly large complexes, North America, Northeast Atlantic, the South, Northeast Atlantic North. And we can do that beginning about 1971, with the exception of the Northeast Atlantic side, where we're starting in 82. But basically, we have about a 40-year or 45-year time series where we can look back and estimate abundance and see how that's changed. And we can do that at 3 levels. We can look at the whole abundance of the North Atlantic, so pre-fishery abundance, everything combined. We can look at abundance back to rivers by region, and then we can start to focus in on returns to rivers. And hopefully, there's some coherence that returns to rivers reflect what we think came back to the regions, and the returns to regions reflect what we think was out in the ocean before we fished them. So that's always the challenge. So let's look at the big one, which is how many fish are out there in the North Atlantic. So we can do that, as I said, 3 complexes. We have North America, Southern Europe, and Northern European countries. And here is the time series of estimated abundance of Atlantic salmon as of January 1st in the first winter at sea for North America, for Southern Europe, and then for Northern Europe beginning at a later time. So you can see what's evident from this plot, that we see a decline. We see decline in the Southern European populations, quite severe decline, about 60% over that time period. We see North America, a decline, about 45%, and as well Northern NEAC. Second thing we can see is that Southern European salmon are much more abundant than North American salmon. They were as much as 2.5 times more abundant than salmon from North America. And then finally, if we were able to add up all of these abundances, if we kind of fill in what might be Northern European abundances, at peak time, about 1970s, which our time series started, we're talking about 10 million Atlantic salmon in the North Atlantic as a total for both European and North America. And currently, in the last 10 years, we're talking about 3.5 million. So a big drop, but again, a big drop from an abundance that actually wasn't very high, about 10 million fish. So keep in mind that the Fraser River in British Columbia, in low years can have sockeye returns of 10 million fish, high years 40 million fish, one species, one river in the Pacific. And here we're talking about Atlantic salmon in the entire North Atlantic, European and North America at about 10 million. So it tells you something about the difference in scale of abundance for these species. Now, if we come back then to the regions, so forgetting about the marine fisheries and what happens at sea, how many fish did we actually see back to the rivers or back to the different regions? So collectively for North America, we can look at small salmon and large salmon. So for small salmon, overall in North America, we see a lot of variation. We tend to see generally increasing abundances, but really not that many, about 400,000 fish. But keep in mind that until about 1985, we were harvesting about as many salmon at sea, small salmon at sea, as were actually showing up back in our rivers. And then when we turned off that fishery, basically everything that's at sea is coming back, we see a very minimal change in abundance. So quite clearly, there were a lot more small salmon back here than there are now, so something has changed. And large salmon is even more dramatic. We could argue that what we're seeing in terms of returns back to rivers overall for North America, in fact, has declined. But keep in mind that in the 1970s, we were harvesting about 3 times as many fish as we're actually returning back to North America. So if we look at what we see back in our rivers, it's low. But when you consider how many fish there were that could potentially have returned, it's dramatically lower. Now, if we drill down by region now, in terms of Labrador and Newfoundland, so if we look first of all, we can see for small salmon and for large salmon for Newfoundland and Labrador, people back in the rivers might say, gosh, there's more fish now than there ever was when you look at what's in the rivers. And that seems to be what the data are telling us, keeping in mind again that for both small salmon and large salmon, back in this low phase, there were basically fish were there, but they were being harvested at sea. If we look at what's happening for large salmon in the mainland areas, for Quebec, Southern Gulf, for the Bay of Fundy, Atlantic Coast, Nova Scotia, and USA, the pattern is basically decline. There's very severe declines, particularly in the Bay of Fundy, Atlantic Coast, Nova Scotia, and in the USA populations where it's been dramatic drop in abundance for large salmon. And the same we see in Quebec and Gulf. For small salmon, we're talking about the maritime provinces, the story is a decline. There's fewer and fewer small salmon showing up in our rivers than there were back in the past, and it's consistent, regardless of what fish have we closed in the ocean and what else is happening. And in Quebec, it's unsure, it's unclear what's happening, but potentially because either Quebec stocks produce primarily multi-sea winter fish. So we see regional differences, but generally we see declines in both small and large salmon. So do we see that in rivers where we actually monitor rivers? So we don't have as much long-term information for terms of individual river returns, but we have 61 rivers. So this is kind of the data that I'm going to show you next. We have about 61 rivers throughout eastern North America where we actually count or have indices of adult returns, and some go back to 1984. Some go back earlier than that, but very few go back earlier than 84. So I'm going to start at 84. We're going to look at what the river returns are for this complex of rivers and try and get some idea about changes in abundance and trends. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we've got 61 rivers. They have different sizes, different numbers of fish coming back. So one way to think about it is to say, well, we need some way to standardize those time series to be able to compare them. So here's an example of time series of returns for small salmon and large salmon. This is from the Miramichi River, 1984 to 2000 returns, large salmon returns. First thing to keep in mind is you can see the scales are quite different. We're talking about 50 to 150,000 for small salmon. We're talking 10 to 35,000 for large. So if we want to get a consistent pattern, we got to find some way to standardize this. So the way we do this, the way I've done this, is I've picked the standard period. It's the period 1998 to 2007. And I calculate the average. So for the small salmon from Miramichi, for example, it's 31,000. For large salmon, it's 18,400. Then you calculate the standard deviation of those returns over that 10-year period. It's about 7,400 for small, 3,000 for large. You can see that the variation of the small salmon is more important than it is for large. So there's more annual variation in the small than there is for large. And so we use these data then, this time period, this means the standard deviation, to come up with a standardized time series. So what we end up doing is we subtract the annual return. From the annual return, we subtract the mean, then we divide the standard deviation. You can get what's called the rescaled abundance in standard deviations. So all this does is change the scale on the act. It doesn't change the pattern. You can see you can recover exactly this pattern of returns, this here that you see here. Nothing has changed. Only the scale has changed. And we do that because now we have rivers on a common scale. We have an average period which is at 0. And we can demonstrate, we can have a sense of how variable the differences are year on year by looking at standard deviations. So if we look at the dot, and I've colored the dots here to correspond to the anomalies. So a blue color means it's a positive anomaly. So when it's blue, it means the returns are much, much higher than the average. A red means that the returns are much, much lower than the average. And because we've scaled it, we standardized it by the deviation, anything that's within plus or minus 2 standard deviations, we consider to be roughly normal. So if you get a return that's within plus or minus 2 of this average, we would consider that not to be very unusual. That's okay. We've seen that before. That's not an exceptional thing. If you're outside, if you're above plus 2, or if you're below minus 2, then you say, oh, that's quite different. Now we can see this pattern. We have 61 of these. How do we translate that then into a big picture? All I do then is I take this, you basically have a color line. So now we have these points here where the scale disappears, but you have to look at the color. So now I'm going to ask you to keep in mind that we're going to be looking at this type of a pattern and understanding what that means in terms of return. So if it's bright blue, that was a high abundance year. If it's white to light red, light blue, that's just an average abundance year. And if it's red or bright red, those are very low abundance years. So that's how we're going to interpret individual river returns using just this color scale over time for each river. All right? And when you do that, you get this. So the details right now, if you spend a lot of time looking at individual details, I think you'll get lost in the forest. But here's the picture. So I'll walk you through this graph. What we have then is a panel for small salmon, a panel for large salmon. Each row is a river, all right? So like as I showed you before, here's a row for Miramichi small salmon, and then here's a row for Miramichi small salmon. You see this row right here, okay? So each row is a river. Each column is a year. And if it's dark, or if it's dark gray or black, that means there's no data, so we can ignore those. And the blue lines here, the teal lines, just separate regions. And we're going from south to north. And here's your scale. So if it's bright blue, it means that it's a very positive anomaly. If it's a bright red, it's a very negative anomaly. So here's the big picture. If you look at the picture, if you stand back, just look at the colors, you see patterns of colors. It's not just a scatter of reds and blues and lights. What we see, for example, are some areas where we have a lot of reds initially, followed by blue at the end. And vice versa, we have a lot of blue at the beginning, a lot of red at the end. So this is stocks that are low and increasing. These are rivers where returns are high and decreasing. So we can see that's how you'd interpret the colors and how you might visualize what's happening over time. If you look at the southern areas, these are the maritime provinces, USA, a very striking pattern, fairly consistent. You have blues at the start, reds at the end. These populations, in terms of returns back to rivers, are going down, and they're going down geographically, collectively as a group. This is not, you don't see one river going up, another going down. They're collectively doing the same thing. And it's been very low returns since about 2010 and forward. If we look at Newfoundland, the striking differences, a lot of the rivers were low initially and positive blue at the end, so things are going up, with the exception of rivers up the south coast of Newfoundland here, where basically there were high abundance initially, and then they're declining. So contrasting pattern of return in Newfoundland depending upon geographic location. And you can see large-scale effects going over large geographic areas in individual years. So for example, 2011, this row here is predominantly blue when you go from the southern areas all the way up to Quebec. So 2011 was a positive year for large salmon in most of eastern North America all the way up to Newfoundland. Compare that with 2014 for large salmon, where the color is predominantly red. So basically 2014 was a dud year for large salmon, again from the southern areas all the way to Quebec. So very, very contrasting conditions over 2 years, but similar conditions over large geographic areas. And then you can see as well for small salmon, we're talking about the whole maritime provinces, US, and even southern Quebec. It's been a low return year, low balances for the last 5 years. So we see consistent patterns in individual river returns over time that match the regional returns, that match the overall global returns. So there is some consistency in what we see geographically and over time. So we see this large scale versus local scale effect. So quite clearly, the abundance of Atlantic salmon in individual rivers, they can be affected by local factors, how many juveniles are produced in freshwater, the initial survival at smolt migration, but also by broad scale factors that happen at sea. So for example, when all the fish go to Labrador Sea to feed. Now there is evidence obviously for regional scale factors. We see declines being more important in southern areas of Canada, but we also see important spatial scale shifts. So one particular one that I want to talk about is when we look back at the estimates of abundance in North Atlantic for all of eastern North America, we had abundance that we scale it to abundance divided by the spawners. So what was the recruitment rate? So of the fish at sea, how many spawners produce those? We took that ratio, and this is what this ratio shows. So this is it's like a recruitment rate, and I'll show you the plots here for North America, for Southern European stocks, and here's Northern European. But what I want to point out here is for Southern European and North American stocks, until about 1988, they were basically producing, let's say, 1 fish per egg or per 1,000 eggs, okay? But something happened in 89 to 1991, this dramatic drop, and then they continued at a much lower rate, about half the rate which they did prior to that. Now, why is this relevant? Because this has been described in the literature for Atlantic salmon with other species that there was a regime shift that happened in the Atlantic Ocean. We see it in productivity for salmon, but it also shows up as indices of plankton. So both copepods in Gulf of Maine and plankton on the North Sea and European side, there was a dramatic shift in indices of those plankton communities that happened at that same time as we saw the shift in Atlantic salmon. And this change here has persisted for Atlantic salmon despite 20 years or 25 years later, we still see fairly low productivity in Atlantic salmon for Southern Nyack and North America. So a large scale effect in the ocean that's persisted. So the largest gains actually I think can be achieved by improving marine survival, but our understanding of marine ecology, although improving, is actually still quite limited. So we know that salmon spend much of their time in the surface waters, but they dive deep to look for food. So we know that from surveys. We also know from some literature that they spend a lot of their time at the surface at night. And we also know that you tend to get more salmon at sea over a very restricted temperature range than at colder, warmer temperatures. Migration routes are still generally inferred. They're not really well known. We infer what they are from where we capture fish at sea, and what salmon feed on is still remains to be descriptive. We have not a very good understanding of the diversity of food they've eaten, how much they depend on different foods for their growth, and so on. Many studies show correlations between marine climate and salmon growth and survival, but then they're correlational. There's no cause and effect. And the North Atlantic Oscillation Index seems to be related to abundance in the Northeast Atlantic, but not the Northwest. So why is that? And then finally, when we capture salmon at sea, we're really limited. We're really still limited in knowing where that salmon is from, which region it's from. We can pretty well know. So far, the genetics information allows to distinguish about 12 regions in North America. That's improving, but we still don't know river-specific origin of a fish, where it's from. So the question is, why is our knowledge still so limited? Well, I think to me, it's understandable that we know very little yet about Atlantic salmon, particularly how our response to its environment, because we've actually have very little time with which to interact with this species. And the first observations we have of Atlantic salmon and people are from recoveries and archaeological sites dating about 40,000 years ago. So we know that from archaeological information that salmon remains were found in locations where probably Homo sapiens had a refuge in. So we know salmon were there and there was some interaction with people. That's about all we know. We probably know that people and salmon interacted from about 12,000 years to the present. Since the retreat of the last glaciers, the last ice age, as Homo sapiens spread throughout Europe, and as they spread into North America, they began to interact with Atlantic salmon as it also spread with the retreat of the glaciers. But if you look at that 12,000 years of interaction between people and salmon in a more interactive way, that's only 0.2% of the species' evolutionary legacy, and it's only 2% since Atlantic salmon actually split between Northwest and Northeast. So very, very short time span. The first written records in terms of salmon and fishing regulations and even the Magna Carta, it's only 10% of the time that salmon have expanded their range after the glaciers retreated. If we look at overfishing concerns and poaching from 1500s to development of hatcheries in the early 1700s, that's still only 6% of salmon's life history since after its post-range expansion. Reliable data on fisheries actually begin about mid-1800s, and that depends on which area you're talking about. And if we look at quantitative assessments, we actually can estimate abundance. How many fish were there in terms of fisheries catches and population estimates? It's less than 60 years of information which we have to work with. That's 0.6% of the time that salmon has existed or colonized the rivers in Eastern North America and Europe. So very, very short time. So we shouldn't expect to understand a lot about how the animal responds to environment. We've had such a very short time to actually study it. So why is this challenging, particularly from marine ecology? Well, I think there's four things. There aren't a whole lot of Atlantic salmon to study to begin with in the Atlantic Ocean, as I said before. There may be 4 million fish. When they go to sea, they spread out over large North Atlantic. They're basically 4 million fish are spread out over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Very, very few fish to find within a very large area. And even if we were to study individual rivers, the population themselves are actually quite small. Most of our salmon rivers are small rivers. The population sizes are very small. So you begin with a small population to begin with. And then the worst thing is when they go to sea, they basically die. They all die over time. So if you want to study where fish die, what time, when in the life cycle they die, you quickly lose numbers. They die very quickly. If you want to study these animals over time, you have to mark a lot of animals. We have to have a large sampling effort to actually get those animals sampled. So I think those factors, this low abundance and the fact that they die quickly makes, all these studies where we're going to capture them, we're going to track them, to test hypotheses really difficult. I think if the question was easy to answer, I think it would already have been answered because there have been some very brilliant people studying this question. So survival of salmon, can we change the odds? So I guess my closing messages is that you have to remind ourselves that survival of Atlantic salmon, whether in freshwater, whether in the sea, it's not a random process. It's not a roll of the dice. We know that a lot of factors impact or condition salmon survival. And we know that because if it was just purely random, then hatchery smolts that we send out to sea should have roughly the same survival rates as wild smolts, but they don't, and they consistently don't have the same survival rates. So there's more at play here than simply random survival effects. Atlantic salmon is a freshwater spawner, and conditions they face in freshwater during the years that they rear in freshwater, they carry over and have fitness consequences at sea. So we know that because when they're exposed to contaminants, it affects behavior. It affects adaptability to seawater, even if they're exposed to pH pulses, if they're exposed to passing through dams or over dams, has consequences on subsequent survival at sea. There can sometimes be a mismatch between the freshwater temperatures and marine temperatures when they migrate to sea. So that's an important consideration. And then finally, we know that larger smolts generally, but not always, survive better than smaller smolts. So what happens in freshwater has consequences at sea. And adults coming back, they're not all the same. So if fish comes back to spawn, they can be affected by a number of things. So for example, in the Baltic Sea, salmon there have been exposed to what's called M74 syndrome. So this is basically amino acid deficiency. It doesn't affect survival of the adults, but it affects survival of the eggs. So the adults look great, they spawn, the eggs don't hatch. And this is because of this deficiency in amino acids. They can also have inadequate energy stores. They don't have enough fat or enough reserves to successfully migrate to the right spawning areas, or they don't have enough energy to dig the right reds and the appropriate substrates. So again, what comes back, they're not all the same fish that come back. And there can be aggressive, risk-taking behavior that affects feeding, that can enhance your growth rates, but then puts you at risks. And aggressiveness and risk-taking is a consequence of genetics. It's also a consequence of rearing environment, whether we're natural or artificial. So a lot of these things are at play. And then finally, survival in the end is a process of selection for the fittest individuals under the current conditions. Okay, and that's a very basic principle. Darwin wrote that over a century ago. And I think we need to be careful that whenever we intervene in any part of the salmon life cycle, whether we're affecting habitat, whether we're affecting by fishing, whether we're intervening by the hatchery, we should be very careful, because when we intervene in those situations, we could be doing more harm than good to the animal. So what do we want for Atlantic salmon? Here's my aspirations. I think quite clearly we can probably say that salmon will not persist over its contemporary distribution. There will be areas where salmon will disappear as it has in the past, and there'll be areas where salmon will appear as it has in the past. I think we can expect that. And there won't be salmon everywhere where we are. I think that's unfortunate, and I think we want that. But the fact that that's the case, for the time being, that shouldn't drive what we do. I think we should aspire for better than that condition. The species won't go extinct. There's never been more Atlantic salmon on the planet than there is currently, and I mean the species, because in 2016 there were 2.3 million tons of agricultural production. So let's say 3 kilograms per fish. If they're smaller, it's even more. That's 700 million salmon in 2016 were produced. So that's an awful lot of fish, orders of magnitude more than there ever was likely in the Atlantic. But I don't think that's not what I aspire to, right? I'm more concerned than just the species being present. I think what I would like to see is having salmon in the areas and the rivers, and in quantities and variable quantities that have occurred over the brief period of time that we've actually interacted with salmon. So we could argue, is that 11,000 years ago, or is that 100 years ago? I mean, to be pragmatic, I'd say I'd be happy if it was within the recent 100 years or so, that we'd have the same distribution and the same relative abundance. And I think the only way we can ensure that is to make sure that whatever we change in its environment, because of our footprints, that those changes occur at the same pace as the changing conditions that the animal faced in its evolutionary history. And what is that pace? It's the glacial pace. That's how quickly that environment should change, because that's how the species is coped. 2 points to finish off. What should we do? Well, I think invariably what we can do is make sure that we have rivers and oceans that produce the healthiest juveniles possible. And that includes, because the freshwater marine environments are linked, and I still think that the rivers are the best place to produce juveniles. It is the best hatchery is the river, bar none. And the second point I want to make is for ourselves in terms of science, we should make sure that we can maintain our ability to monitor populations. I mean, it's long-term data sets that tell us how things are changing. And it's long-term data sets that allow us to test hypotheses as to what's driving abundance and how the species respond to human interventions. And these are challenging because long-term data sets require long-term investments in resources. But this is what we have. This is where we should be putting our priorities, is maintaining those kinds of studies. So thank you very much. I'll finish there. It took a long time. Apologize for that if it's too long. But again, I want to thank all the individuals who, over the decades, if not centuries, have added to our knowledge of Atlantic salmon. And these are more than just government people. These are people who work in conservation organizations, Aboriginal communities, people at ICs. It's a large community. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to present this afternoon. And I'd be happy to take comments or questions if there's time, or later, and I certainly would welcome the exchange with anyone. So thank you again, Darla, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Gerald. That was an excellent presentation. So as he said, we'll now open the session for the question and answer period. So to ask a question, you have a couple of options. You can use your webinar control panel, which you should be seeing in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you're using the audio of your computer, you can figuratively raise your hand, which is the yellow, it's the hand icon with the green arrow, and we'll unmute your microphone so that you can ask a question directly. Or you can type in a question on the control panel and we will read it aloud for you during the session. Et si vous le préférez, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français. So bilingual question and answer session open for both. So we've already got a few comments that are coming in. Both Amanda Babin and Rick Simpson wanted to express their appreciation for the presentation. Thanks and wow, very glad I tuned in. A question from Joshua Roy, who asks, if you had $1 million for research, and sorry, I don't have that now to give you, where would you invest it?
$1 million, yeah. Well, I think I would say I don't have the answer, but I would tell you that I would probably contact the Atlantic Salmon Joint Research Venture, because that's a group of people who are sitting down and asking a lot of questions on this. They would probably tell you a number of things you could ask with that money. And I think, so I don't have a single answer to you. I can tell you that I think I would try to invest it in a couple of locations where we can monitor a population from the freshwater stage to the marine stage, and we can measure geographically contrasting conditions. So let's say a river down in, let's say the southern part of the distribution, let's say the Bay of Fundy, a river in the Gulf, a river in Newfoundland, a river in Labrador. And then you could start to look at how the animal responds to variations geographically in climate, local climate conditions, but also you could look at how it responds to larger scale factors. So my answer is I probably would invest it in research. But if you want to think directly about things to do, the focus of a lot of the actions we can take right now remain in freshwater. So how can we improve river conditions, water quality, connectivity? How do we make sure that they have no problem migrating to sea and migrating back to rivers to spawn? I think is where, I still think that's where the biggest bang for the buck is going to occur.
Thank you. So we've also had a number of thankful comments come in from folks. Stephen Chase says, great presentation. Thanks, Gerald. René Aucoin says, merci, Gerald. Leif Helmer of the Natural Resources Environmental Tech class at Nova Scotia Community College in Bridgewater wanted to say thanks. And Anita Doucette has another question. She's wondering, can you give me examples for methods to monitor smolt migration to calculate egg to smolt survival ratio? Because we've been doing egg incubation in brook since 2012 in Jordan Scotty boxes.
Okay, so it's just it's really, egg to smolt survival rates it's just bookkeeping. When people ask me what I do, I say I count fish. I'm like an accountant. It's really what you do, and that's where it all begins, right? It's getting quantitative information on what goes in and what goes out. So you're using egg incubation boxes and you want to know how many smolts you produce. You'd have to basically at some point measure smolt output. So that means in some cases we use partial monitoring conditions. Let's say we use a rotary screw trap and we use mark recapture methods to estimate total returns. If you actually want to start looking at survival rates from examples, egg incubation boxes to smolts, you should start thinking about new technologies like genetics, where you could actually assign smolts that you sample, and you only need to sample part of the run, assign them back to the parents that produce the eggs that you put in the egg incubation box. So you could, using genetic tools, using parentage assignment, look at how many smolts were produced by the egg incubation boxes compared to how many smolts came from another source. So there's different ways of doing it. The new technologies like genetics are really interesting tools because you don't have to sample, you don't have to put a large, you don't need a large infrastructure, you don't need to catch all the smolts, which then always has consequences on survival. But you can actually get at this question of how many smolts am I producing by my action in the river. So so there's different ways of doing it, and there's new ways of doing things that are quite innovative and quite exciting. So we could talk further, but those are things that come to mind.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Leif Helmer. He asks, I'm interested to know what's happening in the southern coast rivers of Newfoundland. I know there's a recreational fishery there. Is climate a factor that's affecting returns there, or are there other factors?
So the South Coast Newfoundland rivers were actually looked at in quite a lot of detail by my colleagues in Newfoundland region, DFO Newfoundland region, and others. And in particular, there was quite an extensive assessment that was done called a recovery potential assessment for those South Coast rivers, where they looked at status and they looked at what we call threats. What are the major threats to Atlantic salmon in the South Coast rivers? And you can read those advisory reports. And a few things have come out, I guess, in that RPA. Marine survival seems to be what's driving that population down, but what's causing reduced marine survival is always the million-dollar questions, they say. So, I mean, one thing that's been pointed to is potential interactions with aquaculture fish. It's still an outstanding question. There's a lot of research going on at this point looking at interactions with aquaculture. Clearly, the South Coast River is the one that I'm most familiar with through literature is the Conn River. And Conn River is quite interesting because that river has one of the lowest returning adult stocks in Newfoundland, if not in eastern Canada. Fish return there very early. There's no ice along that coast in the spring to keep them back, and yet there can be quite cold conditions in freshwater. So I think, it's a combination of a lot of things that could be affecting those populations, but clearly it's that transition from smolts when they leave the rivers to adults coming back 1 year later, primarily, that seems to be the biggest bottleneck. So I don't have an answer for you, but in that recovery potential assessment that DFO published, there's a number of most likely threats that are worth looking at further.
Great, thank you. The next comment and question comes from Fred Worski. He says, tour de force, Gerald. Returns of NAC large salmon oscillated up until about 1987, but stopped when the population dived. They started again around 2010. Think a new crash is coming.
So that was a comment by Fred, or maybe just go back to, I think I don't know if he's referring to this graph. So the large salmon in North America were oscillating quite a lot. If we go back before that, so there were oscillations in terms of overall abundance, and then they kind of stopped, and then they're oscillating again. So I think that's the point Fred is trying to make, is we saw these oscillations, they were abundant, it got flat, and then they oscillated again. Is that another impending crash? I don't know, but I think the trajectory of this population is not positive. It's not on the upturn. Any upturn that we are seeing is being driven by, in essence, Labrador populations. That's the only thing that's keeping the large salmon trend here from going down further. It's the upturn in Newfoundland and Labrador, right? If we look at historically, the multi-cylinder producing populations in Quebec, Southern Gulf, Nova Scotia, and USA, they're all in a downturn. So I don't see a positive, but I'm not going to make a prediction like Fred that perhaps it's we're getting a new downturn, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Sebastian Pardo. He says, that was so informative. Thank you, Gerald. Question, just like there is fisheries-induced evolution, do you think will be any regime shift-induced evolution resulting the North Atlantic regime shift in the early 90s?
In terms of evolution, yeah, I read about that. I'm not an expert on that. I think, if you go back to the fact that this, certainly in the last 12,000 years, we can imagine the change that's happened for this species. 18,000 years ago, there was ice. There was ice over North America, eastern North America, where salmon exists now. And now there isn't. And in that short period of time, the species has managed to colonize, has managed to reestablish populations, has had this large diversity in life history that's developed over time. So I think this animal is quite adaptive, it's quite resilient, but only if the rate of change is at a pace that it can cope with. So this is where, I guess at the end, I thought that perhaps what's driving the biggest threat to this animal in terms of its evolutionary potential is that it can adapt very quickly, but we're changing the conditions a lot quicker than I think the animal has been able to adapt to date. So if we were to slow down that pace of change, perhaps it have no problem adapting. But I think the predictions are that the rate of change is going to be faster yet than what we've seen so far. So will it evolve new equilibrium strategies? Perhaps, but they won't satisfy all our needs. There may be fish in the north and none in the south. The fish will still be there. It'll still be present, but it won't be where we would like them to be. So that's kind of I guess that's the bad news message to what I'm saying here. But in the short term, perhaps there's things we can start to work on, perhaps slowing down that rate of change.
Thank you. The next question comes from John Bagnall. John, I'm going to unmute your microphone. Would you like to ask your question directly? Would you prefer? I can read it aloud if you prefer.
Might as well just read it, Darla. Although I don't know, doesn't matter. I can read it.
Okay, that's what I'll do then. Okay. So John's question is, the smolt to egg survival is not density dependent. So more smolts equals more returns. Why can't we control M in the Miramichi by harvesting striped bass? Or why can't we control mortality in the Miramichi by harvesting striped bass? Mortality has doubled in the estuary. Or do you think bass populations will collapse?
So egg to smolt survival is density dependent, but smolt to adult survival is not, I think, is just a clarification. And then, so what drives the lower marine survival? So for example, can we get better return rates in the Gulf, Miramichi, from smolt to adults if we were to eliminate the nearshore mortality factors, of which people think striped bass is the dominant one? I'd say probably, but if we reduce mortality in the nearshore, if you bring it down to something that perhaps was back in the past, if striped bass has a high mortality rate on smolts, potentially there could be more adults back. But remember that right now, 95% of the smolts, no matter where you're talking about, whether you're talking about Newfoundland or Quebec, or even more in the southern areas, 95% of those smolts are going to die anyways. And so, the little bit that you reduce near shore, or if you can reduce anything near shore, what we're looking for is an important reduction elsewhere as well. So it's kind of a trade-off. It depends upon how high that mortality rate is in terms of the overall mortality. So, it's not the point to argue over what that is. We're still not sure what that is. We have new information coming in. But I guess when you look at the large patterns of return rates and mortality rates, geographically, it's hard to imagine that what we see in Miramichi that corresponds to what we're seeing elsewhere in terms of trends over time is driven exclusively by striped bass. And if we eliminated striped bass, then Miramichi would be something entirely different. I don't think that's the case. Not that striped bass they're certainly not helping survival, or they may. It's a complex picture. But the answer is that, you know, we could try a control program on striped bass. It'd be an interesting experiment to do, actually, if we were quite convinced that striped bass is the major cause of low abundance of salmon near Michi. You know, we could do an experiment. It would be interesting to do over 5 or 10 years and see that if we control striped bass, would salmon respond? That would be, I guess, the ultimate test. And we could talk about that. I think it would be an interesting scientific experiment to do. I don't think striped bass right now, you know, they're spreading everywhere because they like warm water, and I think conditions right now are quite warm for them. They're actually quite ideal for them. So they're benefiting from that. And that's the way, you know, a lot of things change over time. So doesn't quite answer John's question, but interesting scientific question that perhaps is worth trying to answer.
Thank you. John had a second question. He says, lower returns should be associated with smaller fish returning if nutrition is a problem. Have you observed this? For example, micro grills.
So we often think that lower returns mean smaller fish, as if growth is, again, that if survival is purely random, and that if you're smaller, in other words, no matter how big you are, everyone gets hit by the same mortality factor, isn't necessarily the case. So the thinking here behind low return rates are associated with small fish is because they don't feed as well, they don't survive as well, the survivors are small. It's not necessarily what we see. In some cases, if survival rate is size dependent, only the ones that are large and grow well survive. So actually would be the opposite, that if you think return rates are driven by growth rates and only the fast-growing fish survive and come back, then at low return rates you should see large fish. Is how you can think about that dynamic. That tends not to be the case. We see variable sizes over time, and it seems to be that in some cases, grills, for example, are as large as they've ever been. And these micro grills that people speak to, in some years we do see small individuals, but when we look at the monitoring sites where fish are sampled representatively through the runs, we have not seen this evidence of what people call micro grills or mini grills, which would be, I guess, small fish at age, but we don't see evidence of that.
Thank you. The next question comes from Chris Elvidge, who asks, have there been any efforts to identify and inventory new populations in nursery streams associated with a northern shift in distribution?
Not in terms of distribution of animals in the northern, there haven't been, very little surveys actually have occurred in northern areas. They're very hard to sample. We actually don't really know, for example, in northern Labrador, the extent of spawning population in those rivers. They're very isolated. They're not sampled very well. But people are reporting now presence of salmon in areas in the north that perhaps in the past were not. So, for example, we've had reports of Atlantic salmon showing up on Baffin Island from indigenous communities. So this suggests perhaps that at least the marine environment is opening up and being available. On the European side, there have been salmon reported up in the Svalbard area, the Northern Islands, and some were caught there a few years ago and reported out. And again, these are new things that happen periodically as ice retreats and as the marine environment becomes available for salmon. They spread out in terms of marine environment. But in terms of new spawning populations being established in northern areas, we actually don't have any information, and there's no directed program to actually monitor those areas to look for those range expansions in northern areas. So the answer is we don't really know. But we know they can because they're in Angava Bay, which is quite north. So, and there is a population in Greenland as well. So we know they can live at quite high latitudes, but we have really limited information in terms of their range expansion currently.
Thank you. The next comments and questions comes from Lewis Hanks. He says, excellent presentation as always, Gerald. Just wondering if you believe that the freshwater restoration techniques we have can keep up with a rapidly changing climate without getting into something akin to a salmon fishing in the Yemen scenario. We are working hard to combat impacts of acid rain, but low warm water is a recurring theme. Any thoughts?
Yeah, low warm water. I mean, we're facing it right now. I mean, it's the Maritimes this year. I guess it depends where you were, but certainly where Nova Scotia last fall, last summer had, Southwest Nova Scotia had incredibly dry drought conditions. We're facing low conditions now. I mean, these are challenges for salmon, right? These are things they've faced. They've faced that in the past, for sure. I guess the question is how much we've accelerated that change in terms of our human activities. So habitat restoration is always important, Louis. I think we should do that. We should think about these cold water refugia. We should think about riparian zones. We should think about vegetating the banks again. I mean, more and more we seem to be reducing the vegetation along stream banks, either because we cut trees that fall in the rivers, or we clear the bankside because we want to view the river from our cottage, or we have access to resources. So I think there's enough examples in other areas of studies, including freshwater environments, where you vegetate small brooks that prior to vegetation they were ephemeral. They would get dry, and after rain they get wet, they dry quickly. That as soon as you vegetate the banks, over time suddenly you have streams that flow year round. I think those are examples of the kinds of things we can do for streams that will help maintain river flows, help maintain the water table at the right level, and maintain temperatures. So I think there's things to do, and we should never stop from doing that.
Thank you. The next question comes from Bruce Walker, who asks, how important are the salmon counting barriers, like those operated on the Miramichi near the headwater areas on the northwest, southwest, and Dungarvan for collecting scientific data? Are these barriers there primarily to prevent poaching of salmon in the headwater areas prior to spawning?
So the purpose of the barriers in those that you refer to, they're called protection barriers. They were there to, when fish return to these headwater sites, a lot of them are early run fish. When they get to those headwater areas in the past, they were basically in fairly isolated areas. These are fish we value because they provide opportunities for fishing from the head of tide all the way up to those headwaters. They're very valuable fish. And they're primarily protection barriers, but we have through time developed a data series of abundances at those headwater sites, relative sizes of fish, and we do use them in the assessments. And I think their value, for us, it's an indicator. A lot of these indicators are important, but I think the biggest value in terms of conservation is in ensuring that those fish that make it to the headwaters in those locations have the opportunity to spawn and produce progeny in the future. So I think their main purpose is protection, but their secondary purpose is indices and knowledge. So yes, your answer is yes to both.
Thank you. Another few comments and questions from Rick Simpson. He asks, where has most of your funding come from? What amounts per year? I wish we had this visibility here on the West Coast that you do in the Atlantic, especially steelhead, which in the Thompson-Simpson system, is an extinction concern.
So I work for Fisheries and Oceans, so my funding for my work comes primarily from the Government of Canada. But a lot of the information I presented here doesn't come directly from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. It's from work that's been done by a lot of other people, including a lot of conservation groups, NGO groups, provincial governments, Indigenous communities. I don't have the right numbers, but I can tell you that the added value of people investing in monitoring habitat restoration that are done by non-government groups are probably orders of magnitude larger than what the government invests. So I think for Atlantic salmon, the largest investment and contribution comes from non-federal government. But why is it transparent? Well, we have one species of salmon to work with on the East Coast, whereas on the West Coast you guys have 6 or 7 species. And I guess steelhead probably is probably the smallest in terms of abundance compared to the big species that are there. So if Atlantic salmon was on the West Coast at the abundances they are, I think they'd be a low priority species as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment from Tommy Lansari, who wanted to say, Gerald, a fantastic talk. Thank you. So I think that's the last of our questions. So a huge thank you to Gerald for today's presentation. I'd just like to remind the participants that our next webinar will be October 11th with Michel Chouinard, who's going to be speaking about adaptive management for framework, an adaptive management framework that's been used on the Bonaventure River in Quebec. The presentation will be in French. The next webinar in English will be on October 18th, and Sean Hayes of NOAA in the US will be presenting his work evaluating bass impacts on salmon on the West Coast. And a quick reminder to everyone that the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation is now accepting funding applications, and the final deadline for submission of proposals is November 15th. So a huge thank you to Gerald, and thank you to everyone for participating. We'll hope you will join us again very soon.